It's time to talk about my top 10 books of 2024. Are you excited? I'm excited. I love talking about my favorite books. I love whittling down all the books I read to the top 10 best of the year. This is the video I think about all year long. I'm constantly thinking every time I'm reading a book, is it going to make it into the top 10? When I do my check-in in the middle of the year of the best books I read so far, I think, how many of these will actually still be the top 10 best by the time I reach the end of the year? How many books have I not even discovered yet that will be in my top 10 best of the year? I love this time. It's so great. For this year's top 10, I have tried to account for all of the main genres I read across. So you're going to see some mystery books. You're going to see some thriller books. You're going to see some horror books. You're going to see some romance, and you're going to see some speculative sci-fi a little bit in there as well. This list is not going to be a countdown. It's not like 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 all the way up to my number one favorite book of the year. These are just my 10 favorite books across the genres that I read. I will be doing a video soon where I do a book bracket challenge to determine what my number one favorite book of the year is, but this is just 10 books that I loved. These are the best of the best. Starting off with a thriller, we have One Perfect Couple by Ruth Ware. I read this book in a reading vlog I did in the year where I was reading a couple thriller books that had elements of reality TV baked into them, and I ended up loving both of the books I read in that reading vlog and somehow discovered that reality TV and thriller books go together really well for me. This book is also a survival thriller, which is my favorite trope in the thriller genre. It also sprinkles in some elements of not knowing who to trust, which is another one of my favorite elements in the thriller genre. It really has all of my favorite things, and it fully captured my attention. It had me feeling all the feelings with it. I was enraged at a particular character in this book. I was so immersed in it when I was in it, and I was so delighted because I have been reading Ruth Ware for the last decade or so. I've really enjoyed some books from Ruth Ware, but I never really pick up a Ruth Ware book nowadays thinking it's going to be a top 10 favorite of the year for me, so this was a very big surprise. The specific premise of this book is you're following this couple who's going on to a reality TV show where they're going off to this island, and it's a competition-based dating show. 4 different couples are competing to see who is the one perfect couple, but shortly after they arrive, a storm blows into the island, and those couples end up stranded on the island alone without any of the other crew who was supposed to be helping with the reality TV show, and it turns into a game of survival. I found this to be so gripping and just overall such a great time. I'm so excited to see if Ruth Ware continues writing books like this. Either way, I'll definitely be picking up whatever she does next. Next is another thriller I love this year, which is The Other Side of Night by Adam Hamdy. I had a suspicion when I heard people talking about this book of what type of book it might be, what sort of thing to maybe expect while reading it, but I don't know if that's the most broadly known information. I don't know if you want to know what type of book it might be before going into it. So I really avoid saying too much about this book when I talk about it. Just know if you tend to enjoy thrillers that I enjoy, I think this is one definitely worth checking out. It was kind of confusing as you're reading it, but the perfect amount of confusing where it keeps you intrigued, wanting to know what has happened and what's going to happen. And then it comes with this twist element that really brings the full story together, and I just loved everything about it. If you want to know a little bit information, but you don't want any potential spoilers, I will just read directly from the synopsis and the little blurb that teases what this book is about. You're following a disgraced police officer, a grieving author, an elusive suspect, all bound together by a series of mysterious deaths and a boy named Elliot. The Other Side of Night begins with an author named David Asha writing about his biggest regret, his separation from his son, Elliot. In his grief, David tells a story. Next, we step into the life of Harriet Keelty, a police officer trying to clear her name after a lapse in judgment. She discovers a curious inscription in a secondhand book, a plea. Help, he's trying to kill me. Who wrote this note? Who is he? The note leads Harry to David Asha, who was last seen stepping off a cliff. Police suspect he couldn't cope after his wife's sudden death. Still, why would this man jump and leave behind his young son? Quickly, Harry's attention zeroes in on a person she knows all too well, Ben Elmas, once the love of her life, a surrogate father to Elliot Asha and trusted friend to the Ashas. Ben may also be a murderer. The Other Side of Night is a thought-provoking, moving novel with intriguing narratives and plot swerves that will leave you reeling. Even that synopsis is a bit confusing because you're like, okay, there's this person and there's this book with this note, and this person ends up going to this person and that's connected to another thing, but it creates such a fun experience of trying to build the whole narrative together in your mind as you're reading, and then you get this really great surprise. And I really like the direction that this went and the way it ended and just the overall impact of this book. It was very memorable for me. It's a thriller that really stands out, and I highly recommend checking it out. To absolutely no one's surprise, the next book I have on the list is The Mysterious Case of the Alperton Angels by Janice Hallett. This year I was introduced to Janice Hallett's work and my life was changed. I love her stories. Janice Hallett specializes in mixed media murder mysteries, and that's not something I really ventured into before this year, but it's become a new favorite thing for me to read. Out of all the ones I've read, Janice Hallett definitely stands out as the queen of the mixed media murder mystery for me. She is so clever in the way she weaves her stories together, and she also is really smart about leveraging the mixed media element to add an additional layer to the story, an additional nuance. It just brings out another level of the story and the experience that you have as a reader that I really love. The mystery in this story revolves around a cult known as the Alperton Angels. The history goes that this cult ended up brainwashing this teenager into believing that her child was the Antichrist. Once she came to her senses and tried to involve the police, the Alperton Angels ended up committing suicide, and the teenager and the baby both disappeared. Now, many years later, that baby is getting ready to turn 18 years old, and a journalist is interested in reviving her career by writing about this baby who disappeared, who will now be an adult, trying to track them down and writing a book about it. But she finds out one of her colleagues and sort of frenemies is also trying to work on the same thing. They end up coming together to try to uncover what actually went on in the situation, and they end up uncovering something much darker than they expected. And the story did take a darker turn than I thought it was going to. I expected this to be a little bit of a cozier mystery because of the way that it looks and what I had heard about it, and just the mixed media format in general. I feel like usually feels a little cozier, but this one took on a darker angle, and like I said before, I just love what it did with the mixed media element and how that just added a whole different layer to the story and the reveals that came in this towards the end. I think this was just really impressive to pull off. It's definitely my favorite book I've read from Janice Hallett so far, and I can't wait to keep reading more from her. Next, I have two romances that I really love this year and wanted to spotlight. The first one is A Quantum Love Story by Mike Chen. This is a time loop romance, and I love a time loop romance. I love a time loop in general, but a time loop romance, that is a sweet spot for me. In movies, television, books, I love to consume these types of stories that really just make you think about life. I feel like a lot of the books that I read this year that really stood out to me did have that common theme of examining philosophical questions about life and what we do with our time on this planet and what's the meaning of life and how do you find purpose in it all. That was definitely a common thread that was going through several of these books. But this one in particular follows these two characters, Carter and Mariana, who get stuck in a 4-day time loop together that ends with this particle accelerator explosion in this facility. And they keep living these 4 days over and over and over again, trying to figure out how to get out of the time loop, how to stop the explosion. And while that's happening, of course, they are also falling in love. There are some other things that are going on in the story as well that end up playing a bigger part in the overall narrative. And I really love the way this story just brought all these things together and made everything make sense, and the direction that it takes and the choices characters make and the sacrifices characters make and the examination of love, both platonic and romantic, and what you'll do for people you love was just so wonderful to read. I really enjoyed my time with this book. It's the first book I've ever read from this author, and I definitely want to check out more. The other romance that I love this year is Here We Go Again by Allison Cochran. This is a story that follows two women, Logan and Rosemary, who used to be friends when they were younger, and then they ended up turning into frenemies. All these years later, they're being brought back together when their former English teacher, who they both adored, is now dying, and all he wants, his last dying wish, is to take a road trip across the country to get back to the house that he wants to die in. And he wants Logan and Rosemary to both accompany him on that trip. So we've got some enemies to lovers, really friends to enemies to lovers, so a little bit of a second chance romance. We've got forced proximity, we've got a road trip, and it was just a wonderful time. What I loved about this book wasn't even the romance between these two characters, Logan and Rosemary. I actually didn't feel like they made the most sense to be together as a pair for the long term. I just don't see them lasting very long after this book. But what I loved about it was the found family feeling. I love stories of queer found family. It's one of my favorite things to read that I definitely did not read enough of this year, but this one is one that definitely stood out to me. The relationships that these characters built together was just so heartwarming heartwarming, and you obviously know that this is headed in a somber direction since the English teacher is dying throughout this road trip. And so that also brings in a lot of philosophical thoughts and conversations about life and how we live our lives. And what I also loved about this book was there was a lot of queer joy to be found on this road trip. They were stopping in a lot of little towns throughout America where they were expecting to encounter different homophobic stereotypes and places where they wouldn't be welcomed, but they ended up finding community in all these different places across America as they were going on this trip, and it was just so wonderful. And yes, this book did make me sob. Next is the book that I will never know how to say the title of. Diavola? I will never know. I'll just keep saying a bunch of iterations of it, but you know the one. I was lucky enough to read this book as an early copy. I had an ARC from the publisher, so I was able to read this before I heard anyone talk about it, and I was not sure what I was getting myself into. All I saw was this incredible cover, and I heard that it was a horror story, so that's what I was going into it thinking. I had such a refreshing experience with this story because I didn't have expectations. I was just following the journey of this character and being brought along the ride. I was surprised at the direction it took around halfway through, and the whole time I wasn't holding it up to any standards, any expectation. I was just in the story, and I think that gave me a really great experience with it. The story follows a character named Anna, who is kind of the black sheep of her family, and her family is taking this vacation to Italy for the summer, which seems like it's going to be this great, wonderful thing, but she has to deal with a lot of toxic family dynamics while she's on this trip. And that is truly so much of the horror of the book for a long time, is just being in that toxic situation. And she starts to believe that the villa that they're staying in may be haunted, and that is not received very seriously from her family. At the time that I read this book, I had not read anything from Rachel Harrison, but now I have read from Rachel Harrison. I read the book So Thirsty, and I see some similarities in the writing styles between these two books and the way Rachel Harrison writes and the type of horror that she's writing, at least what she did in So Thirsty. So if you're looking for a comparison point of maybe what style of book to expect this to be, that's the closest thing that I found so far that has reminded me of this book. There's a lot of moments of relatability in this book, just about being the black sheep of your family, dealing with toxic family dynamics, experiencing loneliness. There are moments where it just feels so unhinged. There are moments that were laugh out loud funny. And a lot of the story also starts to prey on this fear and this feeling. What if one small crack in your life makes your whole life fall apart? Which is something I can relate to very strongly. So that part of the story was also really effective to me, and it just felt unlike anything I had read before. So I really love this one. It really stands out as a favorite for me, and I still have not read anything else from Jennifer Thorne yet, but I'm definitely interested in exploring more. Another fun horror book I read this year is We Used to Live Here by Marcus Kluwer. This book was getting a lot of buzz, and I was so worried it was not going to live up to the hype for me, but then I was pleasantly surprised when it did. All you need to know about the plot of this book going into it is that you're following this couple who has just moved into this new house, and then one day they get a knock on the door from this family, and the dad of the family is saying that he used to live in this house, and he's asking if it's okay if he brings his family in to show them around the house. Immediately, no, I would never do that. This becomes one of those books that's like watching a horror movie where you're just screaming at the characters like, no, don't do that, don't let them in, why are you doing that, don't go behind that door. And this one just takes you on a really wacky journey throughout the story that is discombobulating and uncanny and just a wild time. I've also come to find out that because this book does end on a little bit of an ambiguous ending, which may or may not be your thing, personally, I'm really okay with that when it comes to my horror stories. But because of that being left open-ended, there are a lot of theories that people explore online. Particularly, there are a lot of Reddit threads where people discuss this book and they fall down rabbit holes trying to understand it and put their theories together. There's a secret code hidden throughout the text in different ways. So if you like to have an interactive reading experience, this book also has some of that to offer you. And I'm pretty sure the next book that this author is working on is also going to be set in this same universe. So I imagine it's only going to continue to lead to more Easter eggs, more exploration, more theories. So if that's your thing, definitely recommend checking it out. The next two books I have to talk about are both from the same author, and that is Happiness Falls and Miracle Creek by by Angie Kim. Angie Kim very quickly became a favorite author for me this year. I adored both of these books and I just need more writing from her because it's so wonderful, but also I deeply want her to take her time because her works are so rich and nuanced and complex and well put together that I don't want to rush her. You know, I'll be patient, but just know I'm eagerly sitting here ready to devour your next work. I'll start with Happiness Falls because I think this is the one that I read first. Both of these books I describe as philosophical mysteries. They're more literary fiction feeling. So they have a mystery plot, but just know they're slow burn, they're literary, they're philosophical in nature. This one kicks off with a father's disappearance and the rest of the family is trying to piece together what might have happened to the father of the family and understand in a different way who he was now that they're looking back through his things without him being there. When the father disappeared, he was with one of his children who is a boy who has autism and is nonverbal. And so a lot of the story is also about the idea of language and language not being equated to intelligence and the ability to communicate not being equated to intelligence. There's a lot of conversation about happiness in here as well. The family is also a family of immigrants. There's a lot of conversation about the immigrant experience in America. There are just so many different elements that Angie Kim is exploring in this story, but so beautifully weaves together to create this narrative picture of the challenges this family is going through after the father disappears and keeping you so engaged in that mystery of wanting to know what happened to him the whole time. It was just really compelling, really beautiful, and I loved it so much that I then picked up Miracle Creek, which also was amazing. This story is a whodunit, a whydunit, and a howdunit. In this story, there is a family of Korean immigrants who are running this experimental medical treatment center in Virginia that is an oxygen chamber, and it's designed to help treat a multitude of things. There's someone who's there to try to treat their infertility, but mostly the clientele ends up being children with autism who are using this as an experimental treatment, and then their parents and their caretakers who accompany them on this treatment. At the beginning of the story, you know that something happened that caused this center to explode and it ended up killing 2 people. And you're following the courtroom drama that is taking place afterwards as one of the women is being accused of killing her own son with autism. Again, this is a story about so many things. It's about parental relationships, what you'll sacrifice for the people that you love, the toil that is taken on caretakers in all types of situations. Again, the immigrant experience is explored in here. And largely this book is about the justice system and what is right and what is just and how does our justice system operate? Is it truly trying to find who's responsible for things, or are we just looking for someone to blame? In both of these books, I think Angie Kim just does such a beautiful job creating these really complex, nuanced characters that really feel like they get down to these questions about humanity. That's why I call them philosophical mysteries. That's the experience I have with them. I think they're so wonderful. If you haven't read from Angie Kim, you truly should. And lastly is a book that I feel like really stands as a symbol for what I was enjoying in my books this year, and that is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman. This is an older title that I feel like this year, maybe the past 2 years, has gotten a lot of buzz, particularly on TikTok. I saw a lot of people talking about it, and I was finally convinced to pick it up. And I'm so glad I finally picked it up because I do think this is a book that if you're the right type of audience for it, it definitely lives up to the hype. The synopsis of this book does not reveal too much about what it's about. It's kind of a book that you just have to experience, but what you do know about it is you're following 39 women who are being held underground in this bunker and they're being monitored by men. They don't really have a memory or understanding of why they're being held there. They have some vague recollections of their lives before they were put underground, but they don't really have a full sense of why they are there. And uniquely, there is one young girl who is also in the bunker with them, and she is the main focus of the story. And as the synopsis says, she may be their key to escape and survival. This book should have been really boring. It's very claustrophobic, it's very insular, it's very slow, and not a lot happens. It's a bit repetitive, and all of those things should make it not good, but it works so well for the type of story this is. It's truly such a meditation on life and our existence and how we spend our time, and the question of what is a life well lived? What is the purpose of life? Is it a destination? Or is it just the pursuit of something? Is it community? The whole story felt like this metaphor of searching for the meaning in life, and it just had this really peaceful feeling to it as well. I feel like it just left such an impact on me. It's also a relatively short book, and it's a book that I could see myself reading again and again throughout my life at different times, that I feel like I might look at it a different way at different points in my life. It kind of broke my brain a little, and I loved it for that. So that is it for my top 10 books of 2024. Looking at these books really feels like such an encapsulation of my reading year and the books that really stood out and the things I was really enjoying reading. And doing this just makes me want to read all these books again right now. I just love them all so much. Let me know down in the comments below if you've read any of these books and if you have similar thoughts, or let me know if I've convinced you to pick any of them up. That is my hope and my dream and my wish, that I get these books in more people's hands and that you enjoy them just as much as I did. That's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.